to the end of myself. I know that without you I'm broken. I put all the pieces of me at your feet. It's what you speak, it's what I need. Hear my soul cry desperately. Here I am, I've come to the end of myself, and I need you, and nothing else. Everything at your feet, the little things, everything in between. Surrendering every part of me. Yeah.
Good morning. Welcome to Calvary Chapel of the Sandhills. Good morning. What a big crowd. Wow. Good to see you all. Water turned into wine, opened the eyes of the blind. There's no one like you, none like you. Into the darkness you shine, out of the ashes we rise. There's no one like you, none like you. Our God is greater, our God is stronger. God, you are higher than any other. Our God is healer, awesome in power. Our God, our God. Into the darkness you shine, out of the ashes we rise. There's no one like you, none like you. Our God is greater, our God is stronger. God, you are higher than any other. Our God is healer, awesome in power. Our God, our God. And if our God is for us, then who could ever stop us? And if our God is with us, what could stand against? If our God is for us, who could ever stop us? And if our God is with us, what could stand against? Our God is greater, our God is stronger. God, you are higher than any other. Our God is healer, awesome in power. Our God, our God. Our God is greater, our God is stronger. God, you are higher than any other. Our God is healer, awesome in power. Our God, our God. Praise you, Lord. Now we'll have announcements. We will have announcements. Announcements. Yeah. We will have the announcements. And here comes David. David.
Yes, we do have announcements.
Yes, we do.
Lord have mercy. It's good to be in place. Okay, welcome to Calvary Chapel. I'm so glad at least y'all are here. Okay, I think everything on here you folks know about we don't pass the plate and the tithe and offering boxes, and so I'm just going to say ditto on that because everybody's on already. Thank the Lord you're on that. You know, you got that checked off real good. There will be a home group tonight. It'll be at 6 p.m. in the Potter's Cafe. Also, the men will continue to meet on Tuesdays. Tuesday night, we're going through the book, The Jesus Style by Gail Irwin. And also, worship and prayer night will be this coming Wednesday. That's what we do the third Wednesday of every month. And so that'll be this coming Wednesday. And of course, don't forget to honor the Lord with his tithe and our offerings today, and visit the tithe box on your way while you're here at the church. Also, there is a funeral Saturday. We're mourning with Brother James, the loss of his father-in-law. I mean stepfather. And the funeral will be on Saturday, February the 22nd, at the Richard Bowles Funeral Home in Laurinburg. The visitation will be at 12 noon until 1, and then the service will follow at 1 o'clock, and that is James's stepdad. So be in prayer for that, and be in prayer for James and his family, and those that can be at that event, please do so. And with that, let's continue to worship.
Here I am to worship, here I am to bow down, here I am to say that you're my God, you're altogether simply come, longing just to bring something that's a word that will bless your heart. I'll bring you more than a song, for a song in itself is not what you have required. You search much deeper within, through the way things appear. You're looking into my heart. I'm coming back to the heart of worship, when it's all about you. It's all about you, Jesus. I'm sorry, Lord, for the thing I've made it, when it's all about you. It's all about you, Jesus. King of endless world, no one could express how much you deserve. Though I'm weak and poor, all I have is yours, every single breath. I'll bring you more than a song, for a song in itself is not what you have required. You search much deeper within, through the way things appear. You're looking into my heart. I'm coming back to the heart of worship, when it's all about you. It's all about you, Jesus. I'm sorry, Lord, for the thing I've made it, when it's all about you. It's all about you, Jesus. Lord, please bless us today, and we just ask you, Lord, to go before Ron as he speaks, and bless his words, Lord. Let it be from your heart to our hearts, Lord, and that we will be changed and renewed. Renew our minds, Lord, renew our hearts, and make us more like you. And we just love you so much, Lord. And all said, amen.
Oops. There you go. All right. All right. Well, they're getting everything all taken care of. I'm going to start here first. But if you would take your Bibles, turn to the book of James, chapter 3. We'll be going into some thoughts this morning. And I want to begin just kind of a little casual background, because every church I've ever been a part of, they always had people that liked to talk. I remember Community Baptist Church in Bladenboro. I think it was mainly because the foyer area was so short, but all the people would get there 15, 20 minutes early maybe, and they'd get out on the front porch, and everybody would be talking. And I'd have to do kind of like what PB does, and I have to go back there and say, okay, come on in, it's time for service, you know. Well, you know, not only there, but, you know, my whole life I noticed how people love to talk. You work in your garden, you're in your backyard, and the next door neighbor has his garden, and before you know it, you're kind of talking over the fence one to another. Now, there's a lot of talking that goes on. Remember, even in Bible college, the dean had to come up there one night during our chapel time, and he said, now you men, I said, you work full-time jobs, you come to the Bible college from like 5:30 till 9 o'clock, and he'd say, now you need to go ahead and leave and go home and go see your wife and your kids and whatever the situation is, because a lot of the guys, what they were doing is they go by the water fountain. And they'd stay by that water fountain for an hour and a half after the classes were over, and they're just talking. I guess the most typical things that we think about when people talk is like, what about the beauty shop? Now, I've been into beauty shops just briefly to see what they're all about, and you see all the magazines there, and they kind of promote all kinds of things in the magazines. But I'm sure the ladies just sit there when they're getting their hair done, and they're just talking back and forth about just about everything. Now, I also want to say barbershops are bad about that. Now, I will tell you, one man told me one time, I don't know if it's true, is that he said, men fellowship, women gossip. I don't believe it either. No, I've found out over the years that men gossip just as much. Well, if all these things happen and we love to talk so much, is talking really that bad? Now, put yourself back in the New Testament whenever Jesus was walking around and he was healing people, he was touching people, he was raising people up, he gave people that could not see their eyesight. And all these things were going on. Could you imagine how much talking was going on then? I mean, I'm sure oh, did you see Jesus down the road? I mean, I saw this one guy had been there for 30 years next to the building, and I come by there the other day, and he's standing up, and he's walking around the city. Now, I'm sure that instigated a lot of talking by people, but stop and think about the story also of the man that was born blind. And I think it's John chapter 9. Now, the man in John chapter 9 was born blind, and when Jesus came by, Jesus healed him. Amen. Great story. You can go to verse 1 down to verse number 3 about the whole story. But isn't it amazing that when he healed that man, they said, now who hath healed you? And he says, now, what's the deal now? Who hath sinned? The disciples come along right after that, and they say, now, who hath sinned, him or his parents, that he was born blind? Now, please explain something to me. How could he have sinned if he was born blind? I don't get it, unless, well, I guess you believe in reincarnation maybe. But, you stop and think about that, because at that moment in time, we notice that there are certain key words that tell you, hey, the conversation is going in the wrong direction. When he healed that man, he was just so happy, tickled to death. But then all of a sudden someone says, now who hath sinned? His disciples said this. Well, was that the right kind of thought to have after a man just got healed? Nah, I don't think so. Well, I just wrote down a few things I want to give you this morning just as a kind of pre-introduction, because we need to think about this. What are some key phrases that give away bad talking? Now, when people start to say things that really aren't something you should think about and you really shouldn't repeat, anybody ever came to you before and they qualified a statement? Now, I'm not lying, but I heard. Okay. Think about these things. Second one also, and I remember this was his kids, the little kids would get along and they'd want to talk about somebody, and some girl would get up and go ahead and start to say, well, if I'm lying, I'm dying. You ever heard that one? And then you stop and think about someone's telling a story and they build the story up to try to make somebody look bad. And then all of a sudden they say, well, if there's smoke, there's fire. Now, I tell you, there's a lot of different things we do and we say to try to cover up a bad or a good comment. And the whole thing we're going to get into in just a little bit in James chapter number 3 is that James was dealing with a young church that was going through a lot of turmoil and troubles. But you stop and think about gossip as well. Now, what about gossip in general? Gossip doesn't need to be false to be evil. There's a lot of truth that should never be passed around. Another quote, is the art of saying nothing gossip? that leaves nothing unsaid. You can laugh a little bit too, okay? Okay, nothing travels farther than light except bad news which follows its own rules. Well, what gossip is and what qualifies it as gossip? Well, one man said, if you wouldn't feel comfortable saying it to someone, you shouldn't say it about them. Well, and I like this one personally. This came from me. Some people disguise gossip as prayer requests. You know, you ever been in a Wednesday night service? I had a lady in our church that was really bad about this kind of stuff, but she would come in there and everybody's requesting prayers. It's a prayer time on a Wednesday night. And she'd say, hold up her hand. I'd say, okay, sister. And she'd say, well, I think we should pray for brother so-and-so. Well, you know, everybody looks at her, you know, and says, okay, you know, they're getting ready to write something down. You go to the hospital. What happened there? He says, I drove by the bar and saw him walking inside the bar the other day. Now, the kicker of the whole story is his car was broken down 2 miles down the road, and he had to walk that far to get to the bar, to get to a telephone, to try to get help because he broke down. But you know what that person saw? Oh, I saw brother so-and-so. He was walking into the bar. Now, how easy can little circumstances like that be construed and changed? One I wrote down at last, and I'll go back to my word in just a minute. A coward talks to everyone but you. Now think about it. You know, this morning as we get into our word in chapter 3 of the book of James, you'll find out the reason why I kind of gave that whole introduction is the title is that it is the world's most casual sin. Now, not just in North and South Carolina, by the way. It's all over. I've been in different states and seen the very same thing everywhere else. People have an uncanny habit of always having to have something to talk about. Well, there's nothing wrong with talking. You know, when the people were healed in Jesus' day and people saw it happen, they would go around telling people, said, you'll never believe what I saw. Man, I saw this one man, he had been blind since birth, and Jesus came and touched him and raised him up, and he could see. I mean, that's awesome. You know, we testify of what Jesus did. But notice first things, I'm going to go to verse number 1 as we begin kind of an introduction here, chapter 3, verse 1. He says, my brethren, be not many masters, knowing that ye shall receive the greater condemnation. Let's read all down to verse 5. For in many things we offend all. And if any man offend not in word, the same is a perfect man, and able also to bridle the whole body. Behold, we put bits in the horses' mouths, that they may obey us, and we turn about their whole body. Behold also the ships, which though they be great, and are driven of fierce winds, yet are they turned about with a very small helm, whithersoever the governor listeth. Even so the tongue is a little member, and boasteth great things. Behold, how great a matter a little fire kindleth. You know, I wondered why James came out with the analogy of a fire, and we're going to notice that in just a minute. But in chapter 3, verse number 1, he starts off by saying, hey, my brethren. Now, this whole chapter and this whole book of the book of James is about Christians. Now, you say, brother, we shouldn't advertise these kind of negative things, that Christians gossip, that Christians may say things that are untruthful or that kind of thing. Come on now, let's get back to the real world. It happens everywhere. It happens in our job sites. It happens everywhere we go. In our churches, we see the very same things. But he talks to them as brethren in verse 1. Notice chapter 1, verse 2. He said, my brethren, count it all joy when you fall into diverse temptations. He also said in chapter 1, verse number 19, wherefore, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. He said in chapter 2, verse 1, my brethren, have not faith with respect to persons. We touched on that about a couple weeks ago. And then also in chapter 2, verse 14, what doth it profit, my brethren? And he spoke about faith and works. Now, so there's no question as to who he's talking to. It is a believer in Christ. But notice the problem as we go in verse number 1 as well. He says, my brethren, be not many masters, knowing that we shall receive the greater condemnation. I remember so oftentimes when I'd run into teenagers and you try to tell them, you need to hang around the right kind of people and do the right kind of things. And they always get really boldened up and they start to say, well, now, you can't tell me what to do. You're not my boss. Well, I remind you that someone's your boss. When he talks about being a master, there are people out there, and there's a verse in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 1 down to verse number 2, but Paul said, but I will not be brought under the power of any. That means as believers, we shouldn't be underneath the power of our friends, their opinions. We should not be underneath the power of the culture, the way it operates and the things it does. We should not be underneath anything, the people at work that try to tell us how to act, our flesh and our spirit. There's a battle that goes on, but the problem is, be not many masters. Well, as we go now to verse number 2, we notice a little bit more about the masters, and that is 4 little masters found in chapter 3, verse 2 down to verse number 5. It says in verse number 2, for in many things we offend all. If any man offend not in word, the same is a perfect man, and able also to bridle the whole body. Now, if you remember, James chapter 1, verse 26 talked about bridling, and it spoke about the tongue. Now, as we think about this bridle, he says a perfect man is able to bridle the whole body. I remember as a kid, the circus came to Tampa. And I remember as a kid, my dad brought me to the circus, and I looked at all the animals and said, oh my goodness, look at this, check this out. And I remember going around the side of a tent and noticing this big, huge elephant. And I looked at him, and they had a rope about that big around, tied around his neck or around his foot. I think it was around his foot, come to think of it. And they tie it to a stake right there outside the tent. And I thought to myself, Dad, if that elephant ever gets mad, he's gone. But you know what they do with the animals when they're very, very little elephants? They do it that way. They start them when they're little, and they have chains maybe when they're very little. And then before you know it, as the elephant gets bigger and bigger, they make it smaller because the elephant realizes it cannot get away. That thing that's binding their foot is holding them. They can't get away from it. And as they get older, they can make the rope smaller. Because the elephant is convinced that he cannot get away because of that rope. Now, in reality, I think that elephant could have got away. But because they've worked with him and made him believe that that bridle was going to hold him, a small rope can hold an elephant. You ever think about the other animals like cattle? I know a lot of people have cattle, and if the cattle are kind of obeying themselves and doing what they're supposed to do, I often wondered, why would they have that one little wire going around the cattle, and why wouldn't the cattle just get away from that? But in some instances, we find out, and this happens with dogs as well. I've heard stories about dogs that you put that underground fence underneath the ground, and the dog will run to it and stop. Run to it and stop. And he won't go through it. Now, sometimes I've heard of dogs running through them, and then he can't get back in, because the fence is turned on. But if a small rope can hold an elephant, a small wire can hold cattle. Notice not only that in verse number 2, but down to verse number 3, he says also a small bit. He says, behold, we put bits in the horses' mouths that they may obey us, and we turn about their whole body. Now, that bridle that is going to hold that elephant is also in the same word, the same type thing. The bridle is going to hold the horse's head, but that bit is really what keeps that horse to go right and left and what it needs to do. I looked up bits and horses' bits in different categories. There's the snaffle bits that have single and double, and they're jointed. And there's so many things about that bit, but I never realized until I studied this out that horse, I used to think the bit just sticks in their mouth and that they bite on the bit and then it controls their actions. No, there's a space just on the other side of where their teeth are that bit sits inside that space. And so it doesn't damage their teeth. But yet and still, that bit controls the head of that horse. I was wondering, how in the world, how big is a horse usually? Well, 1,000 pounds, but there was a horse named Samson back in the late 1800s. There was over 3,000 pounds. Now, you talk about something that can be controlled by just a bit. Now, as he said here, not only we see the bridle in verse 2, we see the bit in verse 3, but notice also in verse number 4, a little helm. He says, behold also the ships, which though they be great and are driven of fierce winds, yet are they turned about with a very small helm, whithersoever the governor listeth. You know, I've built models as a kid, and I remember getting into the model, and I built a Cuddy Sark one time, and I think I just about got it completely finished until it got tore up. But a boat model about this big, and you look at it, and the helm that directs that ship is about this big. Now, how in the world a big, huge 2,000-ton ship can be directed by that one little rudder? Well, that little helm, in our day, the helm is, or the rudder is oftentimes changed and turned different ways. Electrohydraulics is part of it. They have a lot of different things. Back in the old day when they had wheels that you store things, and also boats in our day and time, a lot of times it had linkage. But it all counted on that rudder being turned side to side to find out which direction it would go. Now, so we see, first of all, there's a bridle, and that controls things, little masters. There's a little bit in verse number 3 that also can control the horse. Verse number 4, a little helm. But now notice in verse number 5, a little member. He says in verse 5, even so the tongue is a little member, and boasteth great things. Behold, how great a matter a little fire kindleth. Now, all the way through our lesson today in chapter number 3, we find out that the tongue can do the greatest good and the greatest bad. I mean, let's face it, preaching, teaching, witnessing, singing, these are gifts that God gives us so we can all worship together, and they all operate through the avenue of the tongue. Now, you take the tongue out, and music is a lot different. You take the tongue out, and speech is a lot different. But you stop and think about that, because this little itty-bitty member, the tongue, has a potential for good and a potential for bad. You know, down through the years, I've never done a lot of counseling, but I have counseled people before in my office. But I've found out some kids go through life with so much bitterness in their life because their mom and dad said something that really hurt. I remember one girl came in my office and she was in tears, and she said, I can't go back to this school anymore. My mom did this, and go down the list. And apparently her mom just put her down in the ground, just completely wiped out self-esteem, told her she's no good, she'll never amount to anything. And when a kid goes through that, she's cut so deep, she may never, ever in her whole life, ever get over that, because that mother wasn't careful about how she spoke. When you stop to think about that, because abuse to women and children is something that is no good, and all these things go along. So there is a potential of good and a potential of bad when you talk about the issue of the tongue. Now, I want to go down verse 5 on down through the chapter and give you 6 potentials of the tongue. Now, as we look inside the story in verse number 5, it starts. He says, even so the tongue is a little member that boasteth great things. Behold, how great a matter a little fire kindleth. You know, we have found out recently, especially in North Carolina and also in California, that these wildfires can happen just about anywhere. I was watching a news broadcast, and they said that even a spark that would come off a wheel of a train can ignite grass and start a wildfire. You know, I always thought it was just somebody out camping that was, forgot to douse their fire, and they just left it there and it began to grow and caught everything on fire. But those things cause fires. Cigarette butts are a major one that causes fires. You know, I would hate to be that one guy that spends his lifetime realizing that he broke a rule of not putting his fire out and catching all these homes on fire, and they lost all their properties because that one guy didn't put out a cigarette. But the damage that's done with this tongue, I want to begin by saying there's 3 different things I want to give you in verse number 5. First of all, it's about that thing of the fires, And it all begins with a little spark. Now, you start off, and remember back where you would get that little stick and the string, and you'd learn to try to figure out how to start a fire? I never quite got the handle of it, but you can do that and have that little string turned around the stick, and it spins, and all of a sudden you see a spark starting. Now, that spark is what you start with, and you start to put little itty-bitty dry things on top of it to try to kind of get that fire going. But in order to have a fire, you have to first start with just a little spark. You remember me telling you the story, I think I told you the story, of me and my sister having boxes of matches, and we were sitting on top of this big building we had in our backyard, and we'd sit the match, and there's no kids in here so I can explain this, but you put the match on the top and you go like that. And when you do that, the thing flips and lights in the air. It's so cool, you know? Well, we were doing that on top of this house, and it had a big hole in one part of the roof. And I don't know what impressed me to do this, but I said, boy, I can shoot this thing that far. I can get it over to that hole. And I shot it. And of course, I shot it, and it lit, and it fell through there, and I never saw it, you know, so I didn't think about it. And we kept playing, hanging out, you know, shooting matches and all. Well, then the smoke started to come. Now, this is living in an area where you only have maybe a quarter of an acre on your grounds of your house, just barely enough room to, you can just about holler to your neighbor next to you and all the way around. But this building was in the back of our property, and it caught on fire. I never forget, running into the house, I guess the neighbor called the fire department. They come beating on our door trying to find somebody to tell them, hey, you got a building back there that's caught on fire. And all I remember is I ran to my bedroom. I don't know if my sister talked to him or my dad got there or what the deal was. And I don't even remember what happened to the building after we burned it down. I mean, this is a solid building. You never would believe. It's probably about 25 or 30 feet one way. Had those jealousy glass windows on this side and a door in the middle, and then had a couple windows around the back. But I mean, it was a really well-made building until I burned it down. But that building there caught on fire over just one little spark. What kind of damage can the tongue do just by one little spark of sarcasm, a sly remark, or even a little bitty lie? I've had so many people come to me before and they say, Brother Ron, yeah, but what I was telling about that person, it was the truth. And they think it's okay just to repeat the truth and just tell everybody all the negative things you can. Well, the little spark is what starts the fire. Second of all, the wood or the fuel secures the fire. Now, if you're going to build a decent fire and you're trying to cook your food on it, whatever it might be, what exactly would be the wood or the fuel that also goes along with this idea of the damage a tongue can do? Well, it has to do with people's opinions. Now, when one little spark gets started, one little sly word, one little comment, one little sarcasm, next thing you know, people's opinions start to go with it. You know, I made a comment a couple weeks ago that everyone has a tongue and everyone has a tongue and has an opinion, you know. Well, everybody has an opinion of certain things, but is it right to continue try to tell people about these things, whether you know it's true or not? Well, the damage the tongue does is a little spark. It's a wood or fuel secures the fire, but also the third thing a fire needs as well, and that is oxygen, and that spreads the fire. You know, that's what I was thinking about this morning, laying in bed, looking out the window, and the trees were all going like this, and I thought, man, look at the wind out there. I've watched a lot of news broadcasts recently about the fires there in western North Carolina and also in California. And most of the time when they bring about the wildfires, they always tell you what direction the wind's going and how strong the wind's blowing. Because what that wind does is that wind will start to take those things and they will start to spread it. You know, there's so many different jokes about preachers, but I'll give you this one real quick, like 3 preachers in a boat. Most of y'all may have already heard it, but these preachers are on a boat. Let's just call it Dan, Bob, and Bill. Well, they're out there fishing, and they're just fishing along, not catching much of anything, and so they feel like they just need to talk to each other. So Dan starts to talk. He says, you know, fellas, it's just us here in this boat, and I just want to tell you something because I've got a real major problem. You know, and I want y'all to really pray for me because I got a problem with alcohol. I mean, just as soon as I get out of my church service and I start to go back home, I'll just find me a big old bottle and I'll wrap up with that bottle for the whole week, and I'll try to sober up enough just so next week I can be sober enough to bring my message. And I just got a problem with alcohol. Will you pray for me? Well, you know, they say, yeah, and they go back fishing. Well, then Bob gets, thinking about his life, and he says, well, you know what? He said, I have to admit, there's one thing in my life that just is terrible, and I can't get a handle on it. He says, I've got a major problem with money. I sit there in the service, and I see them passing the plates, and I see the money start coming in, and I think to myself, boy, I tell you what, I could really use that money right now. And it just rides on me. And all week long, I'm trying to think of how can I get more money? Who can I get money from? Whatever. And all these things. He said, I want you, please pray for me. I said, I got a really bad problem with money. Then they get real quiet. And they're back to fishing. Well, Bill's back there in the back side of the boat, and he hasn't said a thing after about an hour and a half. And they look back at him and said, Bill, you mean to tell me there's nothing in your life that you need to have us pray for you because you got everything made? He says, well, I got a problem. He says, and it's gossip. And I can't wait to get out of this boat. I love that. Now, gossip has a way of doing that, but we don't realize sometimes the damage that those little words can start to do. Well, as we go further in verse number 6 down to verse number 8, not only the potential of the tongue is its damage in verse 5, but notice in verse 6 down to verse number 8, its danger. It says in verse 6, and the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity, so is the tongue among our members, that it defileth the whole body, and setteth on fire the course of nature, and is set on fire of hell. Now, that's major. When you think about not only the damage it may do, but also the danger of it, first of all, there's three things in verse 6, 7, and 8. First of all, it affects the world of man. Now, I want you to turn to 1 Corinthians 6, verse 18. Because in this verse of Scripture, it talks a little bit about here that this whole body, it says in our verse, sets on fire the course of nature. Well, what are the sins of the body? Well, he says in 1 Corinthians 6, verse number 18, he says, flee fornication, and he says, every sin that a man doeth is without the body, but he committeth fornication, sinneth against his own body. He says, what, know ye not that your body is the temple of the Holy Ghost, which is in you, which ye have of God, and you're not your own. Now, as we look at these, you ask yourself, how in the world will talking and gossip and those kind of things affect your body? Well, our actions might start to change. Somebody comes to you and tells you a little bit of a tidbit of information, whether it's true or not, and before you know it, you're looking at somebody a little bit differently than you ever used to. I mean, you used to think, oh, that's my brother. I love him. I pray for him. I do anything for him. But then all of a sudden you hear something. It starts to change your thoughts. Well, our actions might change. Our thoughts might change. Our decisions might change. But he said in that verse number 20 of that text, for ye are bought with a price, therefore glorify God in your body and your spirits. How in the world can your body go the right direction if that tongue is controlling it? Now, I tell you, we have got to take a reality check on this because it is so easy to fall into the sins of the tongue and of the flesh. I mean, notice here, the world of man is affected, but verse number 6, but also in verse number 7. He says as well in our text, let's get back there, verse 7. There we go. He says, for every kind of beast and of birds and of serpents and of things in the sea is tamed. Now, all these things can be tamed. All these things can, verse 7. He says, and hath been tamed of mankind. Now, if the world of man is affected by the danger of the tongue, what about verse number 7? The world of nature is affected by the danger as well. I got to thinking about, Genesis chapter number 6 talks about the flood. You ever realize that what really keyed the whole thing on, it says that the wickedness of man was great on the earth. Now, it didn't say the wickedness of the elephant, didn't say the wickedness of the tiger, didn't say the wickedness of the gopher or the rattlesnake or anybody else. It said because the wickedness of man was great, said, okay, I'm going to clear it out. I'm going to take care of it all. I'm bringing a flood. Now, thank the Lord that God decided to set aside 2 of everything in the ark. He saved the 2, but what happened to all of creation? Now, recognize this. We are supposed to be the crowning creation of God. God has put everything inside us. We have been created in the image of God. We're supposed to live in that kind of direction. But the world of nature has been affected in a very negative way just because of man. Now, they didn't sin. They didn't talk about each other. They didn't go around, saying sly remarks about each other, or they found out some information. They repeated it all over around the city, trying to make a person look bad. They didn't do all that, but they suffered from it. Now, the world of man is in verse number 6. The world of nature comes along in verse number 7. The beasts, the birds, the serpents, the sea creatures. But also in verse number 8, there's a world of evil. He says, but the tongue can no man tame. It is an unruly evil, full of deadly poison. You know, the psalmist made a comment. I'm going to turn there, Psalm chapter 12, verse 1 down to verse number 5. He started the chapter off, help, Lord. Yeah, really, we're in that day and time. Help. But notice it says, help, Lord, for the godly man ceaseth. Now, should the godly be caught up in words that aren't kind or nice or what? No. He says, for the faithful fail from among the children of men. Notice this, and I highlighted all the times it said speak or the tongue, down to verse number 5. And it says, they speak vanity every one with his neighbor. With flattering lips and with a double heart do they speak. The Lord shall cut off all flattering lips and the tongue that speaketh proud things. Who hath said, with our tongue will we prevail. You ever run across somebody like that? I mean, they can't climb the ladder at work, but I tell you what, they're going to use their tongue as much as they can to try to defame her and him and her, to where one day they're going to climb that ladder because with their tongue they will prevail. Now be careful about the tongue, Christians, because we think sometimes just because the world does it and they get away with it and they climb the ladder of success and they do whatever they want to, we think, well, there's nothing to it. Well, in verse number 8, he says the tongue is an unruly evil in verse 8. He also said, a godly man ceaseth, the faithful fail, they speak vanity everyone with his neighbor, flattering lips. We had a fellow at a place I worked that he just had a unique way about him. I mean, it seemed like everybody was his friend because you know what he did? He flattered everybody. He would talk to you and say, oh man, I've never seen anybody do that kind of work like that. Man, you're fast, you do your job right. You know, I mean, everything's all positive and upward and flattering, you know. And I noticed one day that he was doing the very same thing to somebody else. He says, you know what, you're a young guy, but you're doing this and you work real hard. You've only been at it for 6 months, but man, you do a great job, you know. And everybody he talks to, he flatters them. Now, flattery, what does he say? Flattering lips and double heart and this tongue that speaketh proud things, who has said, with our tongue will we prevail. Well, I remind you, there's a damage, there's a danger, but also it's third of all, what about the deceit in verse 9 and verse 10? He says, therewith bless we God, even the Father, and therewith curse we men, which are made after the similitude of God. Now, I use the title of deceit for these 2 verses here because of one reason. If you ever look up the word deceit, it says, the action or practice of deceiving someone by concealing or misrepresenting the truth. You ever bought a car? And I mean, when you go into the parking lot, that guy looks at you and he sees what kind of car you drive up. So he figured, oh, I can make a sale with this guy, you know. Maybe he runs your credit and your credit's just fine. So he shows you this car and he says, that's the car for you. and you just love it. It's the right color, a low mileage, and you're just convinced that's the car God wants you to have. And you think, boy, that's what I got to do. Let's go ahead and buy this car. And you sign the paper. And just as soon as you sign that paper, that salesman smiles. You know what happens? You drive off the lot, and the transmission starts to slip. And then you go a little bit down the road a little further, and you stop at the stop sign, and you turn it off, wondering what that slippage is all about, and all of a sudden, it won't crank. The battery's bad. And then one thing after another, after you sign that bottom line, starts to go bad. Why? Somebody used deceit. Now, some of these words we don't study out very well, but a deceitful person comes along, they can convince you of just about anything. But in chapter 3, verse 9, verse number 10, what does it say in verse 10? It says, out of the same mouth proceed blessings and cursings. But he says, my brethren, these things ought not so to be. Now, James is really telling me, he says, now, I appreciate you. You've suffered persecution. You've seen people get beaten and burned to the stake, and all these things are going on in our day and time if you believe in Christ. But he says, I tell you what, my brethren, it shouldn't be this way. You know, some of us ought to realize, and I'm so glad that we got a chance to go to the Valentine's banquet just last night, or was it last night or the night before? Friday. Yeah, Friday. And the table that we sat at, I have to tell Randy, they're just awesome. You know, I mean, the things they talked about was pure. The things they were referring to, they talked about their job, that they didn't like these certain things about their job, but they didn't slander people. They didn't try to make things look worse than it was. I mean, just really, we had a good time of fellowship with those people. And the fact is that you stop and think about that. If we ever starts to go down that road of deceit, well, in Ephesians chapter 4, there's a couple things that are said there I want to give you tonight or this morning, verse 14 down to verse 15. Because it says here, now we henceforth be no more children. You know what he's saying? Let's just grow up. Let's not go down that road and live that way the rest of our life. He said, tossed to and fro, carried about with every wind of doctrine. Now, we would stop there and say, yes, preacher, I'm going to stand for the truth. I want the right kind of doctrine. I'm not going to go anywhere if they're not doctrinally straight. But notice what else it says in verse 14. It says, by the sleight of men and cunning craftiness, whereby they lie in wait to deceive. Now, I tell you, there's a lot of battles that are going on in our day and time, and they all have to do with envisioning what we're trying to say. I mean, people tell us things, and it's not right. Well, you're going to get in the middle of it. You're going to be a part of it. You feel like just to keep your job, you've got to go ahead and talk like they do. No. He says, my brethren, these things not ought so to be in verse number 10. But notice now also the dilemma that comes along in verse 11 and verse number 12 of our text. He says in verse 11, he says, doth a fountain send forth at the same place sweet water and bitter? Can the fig tree, my brethren, bear olive berries, either of vines, figs? So can no fountain both yield salt water and fresh. Wow. There's a damage, there's a danger, there's a deceit, but also there's a dilemma. Both good and bad come from the same place. You know, Paul, everywhere he writes, talks about to the churches, and he says, you know what? The very things I would do, I find myself not doing. And, you know, he was very keyed into that because, you know, the Lord was trying to give him direction in his life. And we all have a battle of those two natures, but there's two things we need to realize about this dilemma. First of all of us will be a fountain, and all of us will be a fruit bearer. Now, if you are a fountain and you're bubbling up water, John chapter 4 talks about the woman of Samaria there and said that she is a well of water springing up unto everlasting life. Now, when people come to you for some thirst, you ever been to those little water fountains? Say you go to the, I don't know, maybe a hiking trail, and you see the water fountain, and you go to it and you turn it and it bubbles up water. Oh, that water looks so good. I mean, you start to drink of that water and it starts to refresh you. And I mean, that does for you what your body really needs. But you know what this world really needs? Truthfulness. People that are honest. People that will portray the truth and give it out to others in such a way, but also not be a person that's given over to false words. Well, it's a fountain, he says, sweet water and bitter, but also he goes on to say about the fig tree, and also verse number 12, he says, can the fig tree, my brethren, bear olive berries? Now, I ask you, what kind of fruit do you bear? Are you in a situation where you try to witness to people, but they really don't listen? Well, you always wonder why. Well, what do you talk about? What are the things that are most important to you? And when people listen to you, what exactly do they hear? Well, Galatians chapter 5, verse 22 talks about the fruit of the Spirit is love. And we go for that. We say, oh boy, I'm a Christian, I'm a believer, I'm going to live my life by love. But you ever stop to realize that verse number 16, right before that, and all the way down to verse 22, it says, walking in the Spirit and not in the works of the flesh. Otherwise, deal with these things first, and guess what? Then you will know how to walk in love. Now, we notice all these things, and we'll come down to another one real quick, like the distinction in verse 13 down to verse number 16. Because the word distinction means a difference or a contrast between similar things or people. Well, he reads in verse 13, he says, for who is a wise man and endued with knowledge among you? Let him show out of good conversation his works with meekness of wisdom. Now, when I first read that, I thought to myself, that's wisdom. And I thought, okay, that's good. Well, the first one we notice is that these works of the flesh are shown by our conversation. Now, a conversation doesn't mean just words. It means conduct and our works. We spoke about works and faith all the way through up to this point in chapter 3 in the book of James. And that's what he's trying to get them to understand. You've got to have faith in the Lord Jesus Christ, but you also need to have works. Well, our conversation. There's many places in the Bible that Paul commended the Philippian church, the church of Thessalonica, and it talks about them being consistent. They were generous. They spread the gospel in their ministry. I mean, all these positive things. But what could be said about you? We have to be careful with that. Conversation, the things we believe in and how we act, our distinction is shown by conversation. Verse number 14, we notice the contamination. He says, but if ye have bitter envying and strife in your hearts, he said, glory not and lie not against the truth. Now, I know this is really kind of straightforward this morning, but isn't it time we get transparent and say, now, Lord, I've got some problems. I could be a really good witness if I ever got to where I put that bridle on the tongue. I did that the other night when I was teaching out of here. I said, I put that bridle, you can't talk very well with a bridle. But he says, but if ye have bitter envying. Now, what's inside your life? Now, in your relationship, we're going to notice a really positive point in just a minute as we get down to the end of the chapter. But he says, bitter envying and strife in your hearts. A man once said, he says, the problem of the heart is the heart of the problem. Awesome text. Those things that this heart desires are the things we have to learn to bridle. Now, when somebody talks bad about you, what's the first inclination you want to do? You want to talk bad about them. Somebody goes around the office place and they start to malign you and say, oh, yeah, she's this and she does this. What's the first thing you want to do? You want to go back and start some stories about her too. Now, I tell you what you're going to do if you're not real careful, you're going to make that sweet water turn bitter. You're going to make that influence you're trying to have with those people around you on the job site, you're going to have that start to turn in a wrong direction that you never wanted it to. Why? Because of the contamination in verse 14. Well, in verse 15, we also notice the confusion, verse 15 and 16. We're almost done. He says, and this wisdom descendeth not from above, but is earthly, sensual, and devilish. Boy, I tell you what, James just put the nail and just nailed it. He says, for where envying and strife is, there is confusion and every evil work. Well, when we talk about wisdom, we always think, well, now wisdom in general in the Bible is one thing. No, it's not. There's some bad wisdom and there's some good wisdom. And I'm going to show you one real quick, like in Proverbs 5, because we don't realize sometimes that even the world uses a certain kind of wisdom. Well, in chapter 5 of the book of Proverbs, this is the story of the wanton woman. Now, notice this, because I highlighted her lips, her mouth, and her ways. What does it say about the wanton woman? Verse 1. My son, attend unto my wisdom, he was speaking to him. Bow thine ear to my understanding, that thou mayest regard discretion, and that thy lips may keep knowledge. He says, for the lips of a strange woman drop as the honeycomb. Now this is talking about wisdom. That woman, this wanton woman, knows how to speak. She can control a conversation. She can probably control a man by the way she speaks. But it says, woman drop as the honeycomb. Her mouth is smoother than oil. How many men have been taken in by a woman that was smooth in the way she spoke? It says, but her end is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. Her feet go down to death, and her steps take hold on hell. Lest thou shouldest ponder the path of life, her ways are movable, that thou canst not know them. Hear me now, therefore, O ye children, and depart not from the words of my mouth. You know, we always thought wisdom was just something that God gave. Well, I tell you what, the world has its own wisdom. In the story here, we notice the wisdom, it's confusion in verse 15 and verse number 16. It says there is a confusion in every evil work. But now let's touch on something a little more positive to finish up. Verse 17 and verse number 18. To be honest with you, I never noticed these last couple verses till I studied this out these last few weeks. But it ends off on a really good note. Now, if we already know there's a danger also that has a lot to do with the whole idea of how we speak, we also notice there's a damage, a deceit, a dilemma, and a distinction. But now we notice in verse 17 and 18, what is the delight that we find in the tongue? He says, but the wicked that is from above, or no, the wisdom, wicked, wow. But the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, then gentle, easy to be entreated, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. I went down and just kind of listed some things about those words because it says there, it's pure, authentic, unmixed. Isn't that what James is trying to get them to do? Not to go in the way of the world, but to follow the truth path and right wisdom. He says it's authentic, it's peaceable or inclined to avoid argument. It's gentle, otherwise kind, quiet, and of a mild nature. Easy to be entreated. It is open and willing to listen. Full of mercy, that's being compassionate or having compassionate treatment, even to those people that don't deserve it. He says, full of mercy, but also good fruits. I will say, I just put, it tastes good. You ever got around people that are positive? I mean, I've had very few in my life in ministry, but people that would come along and they'd come inside my office or I'd run across them somewhere, you know. And I mean, they had nothing bad to say about anybody. I mean, they were going through their own trials. They had to go to the hospital. They had to deal with cancer. They had to go with all the negative things that comes to everybody. But you know what? They had a sweet countenance. I may have told you already about a lady that I visited in the nursing home. And she's probably not living now because I was, upper 20s maybe, early 30s at that time. But I'd go to the nursing home to visit all these different people that were in there. And this one lady was in there, and I'd come and I'd just think I had a terrible day, and you know, bad things were happening, and I had to deal with all the problems in the church. And I'd go see her. She had sugar. She didn't have any arms. She didn't have any legs. But you know, when I walked into that room, it'd make you cry when you see her, but she'd smile. Oh, preacher, I'm so glad you came to see me. She had, everything in the world was positive. Oh, preacher, let me show you the song click that little cassette player on for just a minute. Listen to that song I was listening to this morning. And she'd talk about how, God's good to her and how God takes care of her. No arms and no legs. I don't know how long she lived there, but I tell you what, every time I ever went into her room, I left thinking to myself, I don't have any problems. This woman has got a positive spirit in the situation in a home. And I'll grant you that her daughter went to see her about every day around lunchtime. She'd go see her mama. But this woman was full of mercy. She had good fruits. What do we touch on in James chapter 2, verse 1 down to verse 4? Without partiality or hypocrisy. Partial. Well, I want to finish up, and I don't know if we're going to have a song, Ruth, to finish up. Okay. You all can go ahead and come on up. I want to just close out with just a little story, and I hope I get the story right because it really means everything in what this chapter has to do about the tongue. But it's a story about Charles Spurgeon. Charles Spurgeon once had a man come up to him, and he said, Mr. Spurgeon, I have to come and ask you to forgive me. And Spurgeon just said, well, now, what's wrong? What's going on? He said, I went all over this city talking about you, telling everything I could think about you. How that you weren't any good, you didn't preach very good, you were no count, and just made up all kinds of stories about Charles Spurgeon. He says, Mr. Spurgeon, will you forgive me? He says, well, I'll tell you what, I will forgive you. And they prayed, and he forgave him. Now, he said, I want you to do something for me. And he took a sheet of paper, and he handed it to the person. And they walked up the steps and got up on the top of the building, and the wind was blowing real heavy, And Spurgeon said, now break up and cut the paper into a bunch of little pieces. So the guy spent about 5 or 10 minutes cutting the in little pieces. They had a couple handfuls of paper. He says, now what I want you to do is throw those paper up into the wind. And he does it. He throws it in the wind. The wind takes them everywhere. He said, sir, remember. He said, I forgave you for what you've done. But you can never take away the damage that you caused. Now think about it. Before we start to say things, I don't care if they're true or not. And I don't care if they're a lie. Maybe you know it wasn't right. Maybe you did it. Well, you know what? Sometimes you need to go to people and say, will you please forgive me? I shouldn't have talked like that. I shouldn't have repeated something. I shouldn't have spoke about you, whatever it may have been. But as they play a song for us this morning, is there anything the Lord may have spoken out to you? You know what God wants Calvary Chapel to be? A pure church. A church that walks in truth. And as we guard, boy, that was loud. As we guard and put that bridle into our mouth, in our bit, and God controls us, boy, we can honor God. We can do a whole lot more if we just follow him. Amen. All right.
Thank you, Ron.
Amen.
That was awesome.
None like
greater, our God is stronger. God, you are higher than any other. Our God is healer, awesome in power. Our God, our God. And if our God is for us, then who could ever stop us? And if our God is with us, then what could stand against? If our God is for us, who could ever stop us? And if our God is with us, what could stand against? Our God is greater, our God is stronger. God, you are higher than any other. Our God is healer, awesome in power. Our God, our God, our God. Our God is greater, our God is stronger. God, you are higher than any other. Our God is healer, awesome in power. Our God, our God. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Thank you for singing, and I could hear you all, and I was like so excited. So can I just read this? Is this okay to read this? So you know there's a Psalm 96. It does say, I should have read this at the very beginning, but I forgot my phone. Ascribe to the Lord, all you families of nations. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Ascribe to the Lord the glory that's due his name. Bring an offering and come into his courts. Worship the Lord in the splendor of his holiness. Tremble before him, all the earth. And you know what ascribe means? It means acknowledge and attribute. And we worship, we want to do that, with all our hearts. It's just fun, and I just love you all. Thank you. You had a great day today. Thank you. Thank you, Ron.